So today's podcast guest is Fred Turner, who I am delighted to have on to discuss the history of Silicon Valley culture and politics. Fred is the Harry and Norman Chandler Professor of Communication at Stanford University. His book, From Counterculture to Cyberculture, is probably my absolute favorite book on Silicon Valley's history, and I've read a good number of them. I think I once purchased 30 or 35 copies to make a ton of my friends
Mhm.
book club it with me during the pandemic, which is, I think, originally how we got in touch because we didn't actually
Mhm.
meet at Stanford. And the other thing that I can say about Fred's writing is that despite being an academic, he's trained as a journalist. So everything he writes is extremely fun and readable, which you cannot say for a lot of history books. So welcome, Fred, to the podcast.
Oh, thank you, Jasmine. That's a lovely opening. I appreciate it.
Yeah. So I would love to start with From Counterculture to Cyberculture, which I guess that I have it here. The subtitle is Stewart Brand, the Whole Earth Network, and the Rise of Digital Utopianism, ever relevant. I was curious to hear just how did you get started with writing and researching this topic?
Yeah, I stumbled into it. I was a journalist for 10 years in Boston, as you pointed out. And while I was a journalist, I wrote a book about how Americans remembered the Vietnam War. And that was a trade book and came out in 1996. And while I was working on that book, I was in a world where computers were supposed to be the emblem of the Cold War state. During Vietnam, they were tools of the military. And so I moved to California in 96 to go to grad school in communication. And I moved from Boston. And when I got to California, there was this magazine, Wired Magazine. And the cover of Wired Magazine was this sort of pseudo psychedelic look. And inside the magazine were these former hippies that I knew about from my Vietnam book. But
Mm.
instead of critiquing computers, they were celebrating computers. They were arguing, people like Stewart Brand were arguing, look, computers are the key to liberation. Now, finally, we can have our countercultural revolution. And I found this endlessly baffling. And so what I did was the
Huh.
kind of journalistic thing. I started rummaging through Wired magazine and kind of working back in time. And over time, it became clear that there was a group of people who had been together since the 60s, connected to the whole Earth catalog of the 60s. And they were a kind of coherent network centered around Stewart Brand. And they had never been against technology. They had always seen technology as a tool of liberation. And that really surprised me. So that's how I got started on it.
Oh, I had no idea it had to do with your Vietnam book. So you were covering the same hippies for the Vietnam book, like Stewart Brand and the same folks?
Well, I was really focused. So the Vietnam book was really a book about trauma and culture. So
Mhm.
I actually spent several years interviewing combat vets in a Veterans Administration program and trying to understand processes by which individual suffering and collective suffering might be related. And in the course of that, of course, I saw a bunch of stuff about hippies, and I was just it, the hippies in that period really were, I thought, anti-technology and anti-military in
Mm.
every sense of the word. And what happened when I started doing the counterculture work was that I saw that there were actually two quite distinct countercultures. One, sort of a new left, anti-war, protesting, trying to do politics to change politics. And then another, this group that I ended up calling the New Communalists, who are the Stewart Brand, LSD-oriented folks who really celebrated technology as a route to making a new kind of world. And those folks were way outside the world of the Vietnam veterans I interviewed in the first place. That's one of the reasons I didn't know them. But when I got to California and there was Stewart Brand and Wired Magazine, boy, that was a wake up call.
Mm. And can you say more about sort of the difference between the new left and the new communalists? Because I think, as you
Absolutely.
say, they often do get conflated into just the hippies.
Right. And this is one of the things when I was working on the book, I was told that, a whole generation of historians had said that, look, Fred, there was this thing called the counterculture. And in the counterculture, what you do is you get up in the morning and you march against the Vietnam War. And then at night, you take LSD or get high or do whatever, go to sleep, get up, do it all over again. And in that telling, politics and culture are entwined. But that telling, I gradually realized, was created by people who lived through the 60s and wanted to celebrate their own contributions. When you actually look up a little closer, you could see these robust divisions. So here's what happened to me. I told Todd Gitlin, who was one of the directors of the Students for a Democratic Society, one of the founders, that I was working on a book about Stewart Brand. And he said, oh, that guy. Ugh. So then I said to Stewart Brand, I talked to Todd Gitlin about the 60s. Oh, that guy. What became clear was that they represented different wings.
Mm.
The new left, very much anchored in Berkeley, very much sort of, Mario Savio, free speech movement, do politics, march, organize, form unions, form groups. The other, who didn't really have a name, but, we'll call them the new communalists, they were really built out of a Haight Ashbury and the psychedelic part of San Francisco. And they were the Grateful Dead, they were LSD, they were Janis Joplin. They were the human being. They were the hope that we could leave politics behind, find a new technology like LSD or like musical technologies like stereos, and we would leave our normal lives and go back to the land and build a different kind of world. So, in brief, the new left wanted to do politics, change politics in the world right here and now.
Hmm.
The new communalists wanted to build new communities outside. They wanted to escape.
Mm.
And in those communities, step away from politics entirely and focus instead on shared consciousness, on the way people said it at the time, getting their heads together. And I think that between 1966 and 73, we have the largest wave of commune building in American history. Somewhere between 750,000 and 1 million Americans leave their homes and enter communal living. That's an incredible thing, and Stewart Brand was right there in the middle of it.
Mm-hmm. What gave these folks the idea in the first place that politics was doomed and the only way out was to escape?
Well, this is where we come back to Vietnam, I'm afraid. Imagine that you are 25 years old in 1969, or maybe a little younger, maybe 17, 18, and you're looking at the adult world around you, and you see these men in button-down suits, LBJ, Lyndon Johnson, and you see guys going off to war, and you see a draft, and you think, I don't want any part of that world. And that world seems to be nuclearized, it seems to be militarized, it seems to be big tech. At the same time, though, you've grown up in this brand new America post-World War II, where we have a highway system, cars are cheap, we have stereos, we have record players, and you don't want to lose all that incredibly fun technology. So what I think happened was that under the influence of Buckminster Fuller, who we can talk about, the new communalists said, well, here's a solution. We can build communities around the technologies that we love and that make us feel like whole people, while rejecting the big technologies and all the rigid, bureaucratic, hierarchical, militarized ways of working that seem to be part of our parents' generation. We can turn our back on that and build consciousness spaces of our own.
So there's one set of technologies that are associated with the military, with these hierarchies, with
Yep.
bureaucracy, and there's another set of technologies that are much more about the individual, whether that be
The
psychedelics, personal computers, etc.
Absolutely. So Buckminster Fuller, who is a sort of mid-century architect and wild man, not the inventor of the geodesic dome, though he claims to be, he is the patenter of the geodesic dome. A very
Wait,
important
who invented
distinction.
it?
So as I understand it, was invented by, I believe, a Polish guy in the 20s.
Huh. Okay,
Um,
because I bought his marketing. I thought that he did.
we all did. I did too, until someone hammered me over the head with it at a talk. Yeah. So no, and he patented it, and he used it first to house radar for the military, and then ultimately it became the sort of hippie commune domicile of choice. And you can still see it, of course, at Burning Man. Fuller had this idea of what he called the comprehensive designer, and he wrote about this as early as 1941. He said, industry is out of hand, it's disproportionate, it concentrates resources. What we need to do is take the products of mass industrial technology and valve them, that was his word, valve them down into our lives and use them for individual growth, individual worlds, individual improvement. And the hippies took that very much to heart. His work circulated everywhere in the hippie world, and Stewart Brand leaned on it very hard. They were very close friends. He was his first real mentor after Ken Kesey. And that notion of taking industrial products and turning them into tools for individual growth, that's what we see when Apple starts marketing, around 1980.
Right. Yeah, and it's also the Horth catalog being the sort of magazine publication that becomes the convener of all of these people. That is it. It's about recommending these tools, these products, right? Like
Absolutely.
whether like camping gear, I think, like
Yep.
classes, you can learn about stuff, hiking boots, tents,
Everything.
everything, and then eventually computers too. And so
Mhm.
I mean, there's that famous Stewart Brand line that sort of opens the Horth catalog where he says, "We are as gods and might as well get good at it." How do you interpret that line? What does that mean to you?
Yeah, I thought an awful lot about that. I think the sense of being gods is something that might be harder for us to sympathize with now. But imagine yourself in the late 1960s. You're only 23 years out from the end of World War II. You've just entered a world in which nuclear technologies can literally destroy the entire Earth. Humanity now has, for the very first time in your lifetime or ever, the ability to destroy the Earth. And in that sense, it has a godlike power that people describe as a godlike power. Likewise, suddenly we're doing things like taking airplanes everywhere. Remember, air travel is relatively new in this period, at least affordable air travel. So suddenly you can, suddenly people are singing folk songs like "Leaving on a Jet Plane." You could wave a romantic goodbye to your sweetheart as she gets on the airplane because airplanes are there, and that too is new. Automobiles are new. So there are these new technologies everywhere around someone like Stewart Brand. And he says the follow-on quote is, in response to that world, a realm of what he calls personal power is appearing. And personal power is that space in which you leverage and access all of these things, airplanes, automobiles, hopefully not weapons, in order to build a kind of self that wouldn't have been available to even be built in previous years. So we are gods in the sense that we have technologies that dramatically extend human capacity, and we are gods of our own little worlds in that we can use those to make ourselves the people we want to be.
Hmm. Did these folks have a position on weapons and military technology, the new communalists?
Yeah, it's really interesting. So one of my most painful moments when I was reading the Whole Earth catalog was I came upon an advertisement for how to get used military gear to wear in just in civilian life. And that was in 1969, and 69 was the year of the highest mortality rate among American soldiers in the field during the entire war. So at a moment when hundreds of thousands of young men are dying, American young men, and millions of Vietnamese, 3 million, so 3 million Vietnamese died during the American War. And here in California, the Whole Earth Catalog is recommending that you use their cast-offs for your personal development. So they were anti-war broadly speaking, but Stewart Brand had trained to be a soldier. He had gone through the
Oh,
draft.
really?
Yeah, he trained to be a soldier, and finished his service. And so he often feels like he's aligned with the military, but I think they were broadly anti-military. But even more than that, they were often, I think, in a social class that made military service seem like something somebody else did. You remember that during the
Yeah.
Vietnam War, right?
Mhm.
If you stayed in college, you didn't have to go to fight. You could stay out.
Mhm.
That's right. A lot of your professors, well, your older professors, stayed in grad school to stay out of the war. Um, so I think they were broadly anti-war. But from when I came into the project after being with the veterans, I was
Mhm.
enormously pained because I thought they had no feel for the war. The young men I knew had suffered enormously and had done enormous violence in Vietnam,
Mhm.
and what they had done and seen was completely out of scale with an advertisement for an army jacket. And if you had known how to feel for what they had done and seen in Vietnam, you couldn't have written that ad.
Hmm. Do you think it's geographic or is it mainly a class thing? Because sometimes I think about like, why is it that California, maybe because it's so far from DC or something, and people don't have as
Mm,
much of a relationship to these institutions, or I don't know, like what creates because I
uh,
think you're totally right. Even today, I mean, I think with the sort of defense tech revival and the boom around that, like I think
yep.
one thing that concerns me a lot that I've talked about with like Tianyu, for example, is where like people are way too flippant about the prospect of say a US-China war. Like, don't people understand how bad that would be and how you can't just
Oh,
like throw these
yeah.
things around as advertisements for your SaaS company? That's crazy. But people in tech, it feels immaterial to them. And so I've always wondered, like, is it just because we're too far? Is it because we're in California? Like, what's going on?
Yeah, the immateriality is a really, really good point. It has a couple of points of origin, I think. I think the first really is class. I
Mhm.
think if you haven't been near combat, or if you don't come from a military family where someone has described combat to you, and even if you do, it's very hard to imagine how utterly violent and horrifying those worlds are. The United States has not been invaded as a landmass in our lifetimes or in the lifetimes of anyone in several generations. The Civil War was 130, well, 150 years ago. So we don't have an experience of combat. The immateriality comes from a couple other places. I've thought an awful lot about this. I think one place it comes from is class. If you are of a class that can hop airplanes, travel easily,
Mm.
move smoothly through the world, you don't have to worry about your body and what it signals in a way that other folks might. You can imagine that you are, in fact, like a bit, circulating through an information system. When I'm in an airport lobby in, Shanghai, nobody looks at me funny. I just look like a guy traveling through. I'm exactly the right kind of person. If I maybe had a different color, was a different shape, maybe didn't dress in the way that I do, that might not be the case. So part of it's class. Part of it too, I think, is contact with information machines. I've always been struck that as new manufacturing technologies come into being, human beings tend to reimagine what it means to be a person along with those technologies. So at the end of the 19th century, as manufacturing really ramped up in the United States, huge machines were there. A historian named Anson Rabenbach showed that people imagined themselves as human motors. They began to think their bodies were like mechanical machines, and hence they went to the YMCA. They learned how to lift weights. They needed to maintain
Mm,
this whole rhetoric that we use now around fueling ourselves with food. It comes from that moment. It comes from the moment when
mm.
we imagined we were machines. Okay, now we inhabit a world where we use screens all the time. And a lot of our most intimate relationships are dematerialized at the very least. I have relationships with people on screens, much like the one we're having right now, where we can see each other, but we can only see each other. We exist in bits for each other. And
Mm.
that experience of existing in bits, especially if you code or do other things that require leaving your body behind for periods of intense concentration, those things give you an experience of disembodiment that makes something like the blood and guts of military experience and combat seem totally alien.
Yeah. I mean, I guess even the way that a lot of people, again, who don't know veterans, for example, experience
Mhm.
war is you watch footage of it.
Yeah,
Um,
exactly
yeah.
right. You watch footage and it just looks like a great big shock and awe. I mean,
Mhm.
when we went into Iraq, shock and awe. Well, let me tell you, if you're at the receiving end, or even if sometimes if you're at the delivery end of those technologies, the shock and the awe are excruciating.
Mhm.
I've never known people to suffer the way that the veterans I talked with did.
Mm. Yeah. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
We should probably say a word about the Whole Earth Catalog just for folks who might not know what it
Yes.
is.
Go for it.
So the Whole Earth Catalog was Stewart Brand's attempt to help the new communalist movement as they headed back to the land in 1968. And so, what was happening was he was in Haight-Ashbury. Well, actually, he was down here at Stanford, and then he spent a lot of time up in Haight-Ashbury. And he saw that his friends were kind of leaving the city and trying to go build these alternative communities, and he wanted to help. And he thought that the most useful thing he could do was actually to create a catalog by which they could find the tools that they would need to build things. So he and his then wife Lois headed back to the land with in a truck, and they drove around to commune, and they made a list of things that they brought with. They made a list of things, and then they added to that list as they went. Eventually, the catalog that they created came out twice a year for 4 years, sold more than 1 million copies. And what it was not a catalog in the usual sense that you order something through. Rather, it was a catalog that showed you how to find things that you might need. And that had two results. One result was that it kind of it manifested a vision of the world as information. That the whole world could be there. The whole earth was a catalog.
Mm.
We were as gods, and like a god, you could peruse the products of the entire world and find what you needed for your own personal improvement. Another thing that it did was it revealed the locations of the hippie world. So, this is 1968. The internet doesn't exist for anybody except a few
Mhm.
defense officials. If you know there are hippies out there somewhere, but you don't know where they are, you go to the catalog, and what you see there are people recommending products with their addresses. And then that lets you find the communes that are out there. So it became a map of that social world. And as Steve Jobs later said, it
Mhm.
was Google for the young.
Yeah, yeah, I was just thinking about that quote right before you said it, which I think is really interesting. What oh, I this actually reminds me of the question that I was going to ask and forgotten, which was about the Whole Earth Catalog, which is that a lot of the original tools, as you mentioned in the Whole Earth Catalog, there are things that you would load onto your truck to take out to the communes. It's
Mhm.
very material, right? It's very grounded, it's very physical. And so at what point does this community in the catalog sort of like shift into the world of bits? And why does that happen?
Great. So one of the great shocks that I had when I studied the catalogs. Okay, so first off, you got a picture. I'm in grad school.
Hmm.
I got this thing called the Whole Earth Catalog in front of me. It's hundred. The big
It's
one is
huge,
hundreds of
right?
pages. The hundreds of pages. The first one's only 60, 65 or so, but the last one is several hundred. And I'm like, what do I make of this thing? And so one of the things that I did was I counted the types of objects that were in it.
Hmm.
It turns out that about 80% of what was in there was books.
Oh.
Actually, it was super interesting. And then there are other strange things. So there's this book on cybernetics, or like, Hewlett Packard's first large scale individual calculator. Why would you need that? So what I discovered was that the turn toward the immaterial had already happened. The catalog was not, by and large, offering things like tools and backhoes and the kinds of things you would
Hmm.
need to actually farm. What it was offering was tools to help you rethink your position in the world, to imagine yourself on a network of information, to think about yourself reading Norbert Wiener in cybernetics, using a Hewlett-Packard calculator. Now, people are not using computers in that world, but all of the predicates for what we will later understand as cyberculture are in place. A disembodied sense of community, a sense that an information technology, in this case, the whole Earth catalog, can make visible the social world and that you can access it through the pages of the catalog, as we will later access the world through our screens and Google.
Mm-hmm.
It's all there. The other thing that's there that's a little harder to talk about are a set of racial distinctions, a kind of segregation. The other piece of disembodiment that has really come home to me over time is that disembodiment is something you can experience if you're part of the dominant group in a particular place. You can move easily through the world.
Mm-hmm.
And if you're not part of that dominant group, people will stop you and check you and say, well, no, this is for the dominant group. The communes of the 1960s, I thought, were going to be wide open social environments. On the contrary, they were incredibly segregated by race and incredibly heteronormative, and they were dominated by men, charismatic men.
Mm.
I was just very, very surprised by that. And I'm less surprised now that predominantly white dominant culture communities inhabited by people who could have or did go to college would have imagined a world that you move through freely like you might with computation, because they hadn't necessarily experienced the kinds of things that a person of color, an impoverished person, a person who hadn't had the kinds of access that other people did.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And also, it's interesting that you noted that by the time the catalog existed, 80% of it was books. It was like the idea that a person was made of the information that they had consumed, not their body, what they look like, etc.
I love the way you just said that, because it's exactly right. And that really, that's an idea that comes to us actually from the 40s and from cybernetics. Cybernetics is the science of control through communication, as Norbert Wiener famously put it. But that's a science, and Stewart Brand is deeply enmeshed in it, that imagines that the world is literally an information system. Norbert Wiener says about patterns of information in rivers of time, which is a lovely phrase.
That is.
Yeah, it's a lovely.
It's funny because now the way that I hear it all the time is I've been spending a lot of time reporting on AI this year and talking to a lot of people in AI world and trying to understand what AGI is and why people want to build it and what they think it means. And one of the common threads among people who are real like AGI believers or something like that is a phrase that I hear all the time is like, but isn't your body just a system of information? Like, and if we just gave that information to the machines, then they too would be as intelligent as we are. Like, yes, sure, like there's tacit knowledge in like say cooking or something, but like you could take videos of it, you could put sensors in, and if that information simply got into the machine, then they too would have all of the same things. And this idea that a human was composed of the information flows that they sort of like intake and output was very common among folks I talked to about AI.
It's a super interesting idea, and I think you just took us from immateriality to the denial of the body. And there's a way in which you can only imagine some of the utopias that people imagined in the 60s, or that some of our colleagues are imagining now with tech, if you deny the way bodies actually work. If you deny age, for example, I'm 64. I'm here to tell you, aging is a real thing. You cannot stop biology. It comes for you, and it comes for everyone, and it really does. And I cannot download my consciousness fast enough to stop arthritis, right? It just doesn't happen.
Yeah.
And so the denial of the body, I think, is one of the things that really hurts us trying to make a better world. If we deny our bodies, we end up making these beautiful systems that do very little for us politically. That's a longer rant. I can go down that road, but
I want one example now.
Oh, sure. I'll take an example from a non-political realm, and then I'll take one maybe from a political realm. A non-political realm, I'll start with dating. I've taught this class at Stanford. It's called the Rise of Digital Culture. I've taught it every year pretty much for 20 years. When I started teaching that class, I would ask students, well, if you wanted to ask a fellow student out, how would you do it? And about most of them would say, oh, well, about 95%, well, I'd ask them in person, or I'd call them on the phone. And, a few would say I'd text. Now, everyone texts. And I asked why. And they said, well, it's so scary to get turned down in person. And I'm like, are you kidding? I'd hate to get turned down by text. I mean, but more to the point, many students at Stanford now are apparently using apps to find one another for dating, which I just find baffling. You're surrounded by 5,000, 10,000 people, all interesting, all young, as far as I can tell, all attractive. And you have to use an app? Okay.
Yeah, on college campuses in particular, it's weird because it's not like you're like the lone person in like a sea of whatever. Like it's like
Oh,
everyone is eligible in your age range, has a bunch of
I
things in
mean, my
common.
God,
You're yeah.
you will never experience an eligibility pool like that again on this planet.
Yeah.
Okay. But what's interesting to me about the dematerialization, right? About turning your body into a set of pictures and stories online
Mm,
for the purpose of attracting a mate, is that when you do that, you don't just turn yourself as you are into the screen.
mhm.
You winnow yourself, you
Yes.
filter yourself, and you do that in terms that are set by the mass media industries around you. You and I bet I could ask you for rules as to what constitutes a good Instagram handle for someone who wants to be dating, right?
Yeah.
You know those,
Yeah,
right?
yeah, yeah, totally.
And they're out there, whatever. The fact that those norms are out there means that when we turn ourselves into information, we
Mm,
actually take away the parts of ourselves on which we're going to have to navigate a complex relationship later in life. We turn ourselves temporarily into advertising in very generic terms in ways that make more complex negotiations harder to have for some time. I assume that people figure it out later, but in the beginning, not so much.
yeah.
Um,
I'll tell
so
you, I think this is totally right. I mean, when I think about it, so I did maybe 1 or 2 years on the apps, as they say. Not in
uh-huh,
college. Or in college, I just dated the normal way in person through people I met in real life. Which
yep,
again, you're like the best eligibility pool in the world. And then for a couple years, I did try to use Hinge and the apps because my friends were on them. And the
mhm,
reason I stopped, like a year or two ago, was actually because it turns everybody into a profile, an advertisement, and a very
right,
narrow set of information that actually the platform gives you. So you put in your height, you put in your age, you put in your school, you put in your job, and they answer like 3 prompts and do like 3 photos. And it's like very prescriptive about like which elements of your personality you show. And because you're presented with so many people, like hundreds of profiles as a woman that you have to go through.
right,
And I began to see all the people as those stats. And I realized that like I started caring about pieces of information that I did not actually care about in my normal life. So, like,
yep,
for example, in my normal life, I would not ask someone where they went to school. I would not
right,
really notice if they were 5'9" or 5'11". These are like all taller than me, so I don't really care. But then I
mhm,
started differentiating by that information because it was what the platform made most visible to me. And
right.
so that I just stopped liking how I saw people, and then I had to get off the app.
So take that, so exactly. So now let's amp that up to the political level, right?
Mm,
Where what we need to do in a democracy is discuss the distribution of resources across under-resourced communities. We need to figure out how to be fair with one another. And now we try to do that through Facebook and other systems where we are once again producing ourselves as highly narrowed profiles,
mhm.
not whole people. So I'm here in rural Maine, and rural Maine's pretty conservative, and I'm pretty liberal, but I can talk with my local friends with care and concern. We sit down and we'll have a beer and we'll just talk because we're in person. These same folks, if they appeared on my Facebook feed, we'd be shouting at each other.
Mm,
And it's in this sense that turning ourselves into information does not help us hear ourselves, does not help us
mhm,
hear one another. Even because hearing and
mhm,
speaking are not just words, voices, signals, bits of information.
mhm,
They are communications from our whole bodies, our whole beings, aimed to reach out to other bodies and other whole beings.
mhm.
Take those things away, and you end up with a very narrow channel and a whole lot of distorted political life.
Yeah. I mean, actually, now that sort of tying it back to the whole catalog thing, I'm imagining like you and your neighbors in rural Maine. And if all you had to decide, should I be friends with these people, was you knew what was on their bookshelf and what media they consumed, you would probably
Right.
think, I
Yeah.
absolutely do not want to be friends with these
Absolutely.
people.
That's
Like,
exactly right. No,
right?
that's exactly right. That's exactly right. No, that is so true. It's so interesting because I do a lot of outdoor things. I canoe a lot. I kayak and I fish. And the guys I do that with tend not to be big readers, and they tend to read, mysteries and stuff. And if it was just, and then if it was just a mutual bookshelf gaze,
Hmm.
they looked at my bookshelf with all these weird academic books, and I looked at theirs with all these, mysteries. I'd be just like, we couldn't talk to each other. But in point of fact, we adore each other and love to get out in the
Hmm.
woods together.
Right, right. That makes a lot of sense. One of the things that sort of come up during in this tangent, which I'm actually is a great tangent, I think it really matters,
Yeah, it's a
is
good.
of course the platforms, right? You have the Facebooks, the
Yeah,
Hinges and the Tinders and the match groups and whatever. And one of the things that happens by the end of From Counterculture to Cyberculture is that the cyberculture, which starts in this like very anti-authoritarian, like grassroots bent, becomes co-opted by the libertarian new right. Wired magazine starts celebrating like Newt Gingrich and like these internet corporations are going to free us from our shackles of
Mhm.
whatever. And I'm curious, A, if you could just say a little bit more about how that co-optation happened. And then B, the other thing that I'm curious about is if you thought that was, if you think it's inevitable, if you think there's a path forward for cyberculture that didn't result in that co-optation.
Great. So I'm going to dispute the notion of co-optation, and
Mm,
this is a historiographical bugaboo I have.
great.
Um, One of the things that struck me about Stewart Brand was that he did not create a world outside commerce and then get taken over by commerce. On the contrary, when he wanted to make social change, he embraced a catalog.
Mm,
He embraced the model of LL Bean. He embraced business. He and his friend Paul Hawken, founder of the Smith and Hawken Garden Company, they thought business was by far the best way to make social change. And that was true of the new communalists generally. They didn't
mm,
want politics in the traditional sense. They wanted to live differently, get the right products. They wanted to be good consumers, and they wanted to build societies built around consumption. So as we move forward in time and the 60s fade away and the communes collapse, we get to the early 80s. And in the early 80s, Stewart Brand and others are just kind of bereft, that the revolution they thought would come didn't come. They all went back to the land and it kind of fell apart and was horrible.
mhm.
And now there were these computers all around. They're like, what the heck? And people needed jobs. It's Northern California, so they went to work in the tech industry. And they weren't averse to business, on the contrary, and they weren't averse to technology, also on the contrary. All right, move a little bit farther in time. We begin to get people like Newt Gingrich, a libertarian right winger who helped set the stage for the right wing we have now. And Gingrich utterly rejects the free love, the drugs, the sort of sex, drugs, and rock and roll part of the 60s.
Yeah.
Totally rejects that. But he completely embraces the individual entrepreneurialism of people like
Mm,
Stewart Brand. The notion that we were all individual gods and could get good at it by consuming the right goods, by cataloging the right goods, that makes total sense to Gingrich. Gingrich is right on board with that, as are a series of other people. And by that time, Brand himself and a number of people who will be instrumental in getting Wired going are consulting for the Global Business Network. They've created the Global Business Network. They're consulting for Royal Dutch Shell. Business is not antithetical to what they want to do. What I think is interesting about this is that it gives the lie to this habit that we all have of thinking that there's an original moment when things are good and that
mm,
bad
mhm,
forces come in and step on it.
mm.
It's a habit of mine. It's like I should start calling it the Bambi syndrome. I don't know how well did you ever see the movie Bambi?
As a kid, a long time ago.
For a kid, Bambi's mom goes down.
Yeah.
It's really bad.
Yeah.
Okay. And everything was good until Bambi's mom goes down.
Mm,
Alright. But that's not actually how it works. There wasn't there wasn't ever, I think, a counterculture that was entirely disconnected from consumption, from
mm,
technology, from the industrial heart of mainstream America, despite the fact that its members said that they were.
mm.
And so as the economy changed around them and as the political world changed around them, they were able to navigate and find their way because they were already embracing some of the core things that people on the right wanted. But that still leaves us with the problem that you flagged, right? Which is there a way not to go down that road? And I don't know. I mean, my sense is that there's never going to be a revolution. There's never a before and after. What there is a kind of moment by moment struggle to try to live the best life you can, to change things where you can, and to work within a world that is not your own. You didn't make it, but you were born into it, and so you work with the tools that you have, and you try to do your bit while you're here, and other people try to do their bit. I think one of the things that really has been this is a longer rant, but it really has thrown the left off its game is, since the Russian Revolution, the Bolshevik Revolution, the hope of revolution, the hope of a single
Mm, mhm,
overwhelming wave of
mhm.
change. And people sometimes read the counterculture that way, and they say, "Oh, that was a single wave of change. Look at all the good it did," and then it got crushed by business. I don't think that's actually the case. I don't believe in big waves like that. I don't believe in revolutions. Not really.
Mm. In
I
the same
believe
way
in
that, like, around the Arab Spring and Twitter, like, that was another, I feel like,
absolutely
wave of, like, "Oh, Twitter's here now. We're all gonna overthrow our dictators on Twitter,
right,
and then we're gonna
right.
have perfect democracy in every place around the world."
And boy, look how that worked out.
Yeah, it's very disappointing because, like this is I think I was like 12-ish. I was in middle
Mhm.
school and I was in some sort of like media literacy social studies thing, and they were handing us out printouts of news articles from Al Jazeera about the Arab Spring and Twitter. And that was how I
Wow.
got so interested in the internet, was because I as a 12-year-old, I was like, this is amazing. This is so awesome.
Right.
Like a lot of folks, I think that was the inspiring, energizing thing about the internet,
Right.
which is like, the tension that I feel is like I do sort of resonate with the new communalists and their desire to sort of like have all the nice things, have the music and the
Yeah.
TV and the
Sure.
like fun stuff that's awesome, while reconciling that with like the political reality of things, I guess.
Yeah. Yeah. You've got your finger here. Something that's fascinated me for a long time. Um, the internet and cybernetics before it are, you know, universal technologies and a sort of universal set of ideas. The idea of cybernetics is that we are all in part of an information system. The idea of the internet is we are all part of an information system, and the information system goes around the globe and it knits us into what Marshall McLuhan used to call global villages. Well, no. I mean, if you try to do politics that way, you end up flying around the air, polluting the earth, and missing it. So I kind of want to offer you some cheer by suggesting that if there's no revolution and if the global internet move doesn't solve the problem, it leaves us with a whole lot of very good local work to do.
Mm.
And you can do a lot of very good local work. Local workers, you actually do a lot of this. I know you do a lot of this. Building local community, working with people who are different than oneself, doing it in our bodies. That's how you make change. I guess I've come
Yeah.
down the side of the new left and less of the realist.
Yeah, I mean, I buy that. Like, I know I've mentioned the like writer happy hours to you, and like part of that
Yeah, they're
is that I
wonderful.
like really think that like the Bay Area is a very intellectually vibrant place, but everyone's very siloed and they're not going to talk to each other on the internet. I know that for sure. But like maybe if you have an open bar, people will start chatting with some folks who have very different
Yep,
ideas than they do, and
absolutely.
and they
Yep.
don't fight. It goes quite well most of the time. But yeah, totally agree with that. Before we sort of turn to the modern day, I want to talk a little bit about Burning Man. I feel like,
Please.
uh, yeah, I only know Burning Man in its modern incarnation, and I'm curious to hear more about its history. It started in the 80s, is that right?
Sure.
And
Have you
then
first of all, have you been?
I have not been, but my friends
Oh, great,
have. I need
great.
to go at some point.
Yeah, so it starts in the late '80s on Baker Beach in San Francisco. A couple of guys get together and they basically tack together a set of 2x4s into a figure of a man, and they set it on fire. And it's just them, and some people gather around and notice that. That's kind of interesting. And next year they decide to do it again, and this time about 100 people gather, and it starts to build up. And then in the early '90s, the Park Service has gotten tired of these guys burning sticks on the beach, and so they say, okay, great. So they head out to the Black Rock Desert in Nevada, and the Black Rock Desert is a very hot, from my perspective, hostile environment. Very alkali. It's a former lake bed, and it's alkali dust that will eat your flesh if you do not wear the proper lotions to protect yourself. They go there and they draw a line in the sand, and the line in the sand, they say, okay, when you jump over this line in the sand, you've left the other world behind, and we're in a world of total freedom. And at first, it's a few hundred people, and they range. They're some artists. There are a lot of tech folks. There's some gun nuts, people with some alternative sexual proclivities, and it goes from there, and it builds from there, and it builds just incredibly rapidly. So I went 3 times. The first time I went was, I think, 2006, and I don't know, there may have been 13, 14,000 people there. The last time I went was 2017, maybe, and I think there were 35,000. Last time, 70,000. Just an incredible thing for folks who haven't been. It's a giant horseshoe-shaped city in the middle of the desert, surrounded by mountains on all sides. And I don't know, I think that the points of the horseshoe are probably about a mile or two apart, a few miles apart, maybe. And there's officially no money, though you can, in fact, spend money at a cafe. You have to bring everything of your own to take care of yourself. And you're expected to do something to contribute to the community, whether that's a lecture or an art performance or just costuming yourself in a happy way. And then there are cars allowed, but the cars are art cars, and some are giant ships, some are giant monsters. And these are all public transportation, so you can hail them and ride around in them, and that's all there is. And so there's a tremendous amount of building under difficult circumstances, which is very fun. And what happens is that people get together before the burn, form a camp, build something with the camp, bring it to the desert, erect it, do something in the desert, perform in the desert, and then eventually go home. And what I've argued is that process is the value system of Silicon Valley in miniature.
Hmm.
When you go out there, there are all these tech folks,
Yeah.
and they're like, yeah, it's great. This is like the dream team, right? This is like the dream development team, only this time we're working for ourselves. And, the things that we make will be seen. And it's almost as though the values of Burning Man are the values of Silicon Valley without the corporate side of it.
Hmm.
I often think of it as being like a Protestant church in the industrial era. In the industrial era, if you lived in a factory town and you would all go to church on Sunday, the factory shuts down, you go to church. And in the church, the bosses sit up front, middle management sits behind them, and the workers sit and stand behind that. Burning Man, you all get together in project teams, you form a camp, you build a product, and you disassemble and go home.
Yeah.
And then next year you do it again. And you do it with a kind of religious patina, with a kind of ceremonial patina, partying every night, sometimes taking LSD, other drugs, dancing around the man or running around the man when he burns, and then sitting quietly the next day. It's an incredible experience. I'm very glad I went. I don't need to go again, but I'm very glad I went.
For the first burners, what were their goals?
I really don't know. Of the first two, I think only one is alive. I'm really not sure what their first goals were. I think that by the time we get to the early 90s and people are headed out to the desert, the goal is to create a kind of what Hakim Bey used to call a temporary autonomous zone, a
Mm-hmm.
zone where you can be autonomous for some period of time,
Hmm.
do all the things that, law proscribes in other places. I think that's the starting point. And then gradually it builds up. And very early on, tech folks are going and bringing Silicon Valley values with them. Stewart Brand goes very early.
Hmm.
Google hires Eric Schmidt
Oh, yeah.
in part because they meet him out there.
Oh, really? I didn't know that.
Yeah.
Oh.
Google in '99, Google shut down. The entire firm shut down so that they could all go out to the playa. The whole reason I got onto Burning Man at all was that I'd finished the Counterculture book and was sort of looking for something new to do, and went to see a friend over at Google in Mountain View. And I walk in the front door, and there are all these pictures of shirtless people spinning fire, and I'm like, "What? This is supposed to be a major firm?"
Yeah, yeah.
I mean, I'd studied like IBM. I was expecting people in tweed with like
Oh,
pink.
no.
Yeah, no, no,
Yeah.
no, 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 right?
Yeah,
It
depending
turned
on the company, like, all work just stops. Like, even if they don't formally take the time off, like, work just stops because enough people are out that you can't really do anything anymore,
right.
which is really interesting. The permanent communes that they tried didn't work and they fell apart, but these are sort of like pop-up communes so that people get their
Mm.
dose of it or something like
I
that.
really like the idea of a pop-up commune. I think that's really valuable. Yeah, I think that's right. And it is funny. One of the years I went out with people who had been merry pranksters in the 60s. And that was fascinating to behold because these are people who, when we went out, were in 70, 71, 72 years old. The Black Rock Desert is not an easy place.
Yeah.
But I watched these folks who had been on communes get their camp set up and get things moving and making food and getting it all going on. They had it going on. And I was like, yeah, these guys know how to do this because they did the communes.
Mhm. Yeah, it seems very hard, and I feel like the cool thing about it that I hear from my friends who go is that you do get some amount of, like, intergenerational transfer because it's, like, knowing
Mm,
how to put on the camps and make these big installations and brave the desert, which, as you say, is a very hostile environment. It is a bunch of, like, tacit knowledge and stuff, like, obviously, you can, like, look up guides, I'm sure people have written lots of blog posts and stuff, but the thing that probably makes it succeed is going in a group of people who have been before and having
correct.
that knowledge transfer, which, a lot of my friends who are in their mid-20s, they're sort of like, "Yeah, I feel like I really got to get to know people who are older, who otherwise I never would have met in San Francisco."
Right. And it's really fun. I will say that as one of the people who first went when he was middle aged, that's part of the fun for me is again being in an intergenerational space.
Mm.
I want to meet people in their 20s and 30s. Right now I'm learning more from people in their 30s and 40s than I am from people my own age or older. That's for sure.
Hmm. What was your, gift or your camp or whatever when you went?
Oh, well, so the first time I went out, I went with my fishing buddy as my helper.
Oh,
Um,
nice.
yeah, it turned out he was a terrible camper in the desert. Great on water, terrible in the desert. But we stayed in the journalist camp. There's a journalist camp out there
Oh.
because I was officially doing research. I had an
Mm.
institutional review board certification from Stanford. That was one of my favorite things. And the IRB board says, "Well, will anyone be intoxicated?" And I'm like, maybe. And, so I had to give this IRB form to everyone I was interviewing, right? And it
Mm.
was hysterical. During the day I wore street clothes to try to look
Mhm.
like the sociologist and, not
Mhm.
deceive people. In the evening, I partied and dressed up and did all the
Mhm.
rest of it. During the day, I went out and, I went one day to this camp called Burning Silicon, and I wanted to talk to them because they were involved in a bunch of different local firms, and I was just curious about the connection between the firm and the event. I get there. It turns out that they are nudist polyamorists, mostly middle-aged, sitting in a giant circle, 20 or 30 people. And I get there in my khaki pants and my white button-down shirt, and I meet the person I'm supposed to meet, and I say, I've got this IRB form. And he says, well, that's fine. You can give it to us if you give us each a hug. And they lined up, and I hugged them one at a time and gave them the form, and had some great interviews. Yeah, so it's a wild place.
Yeah. Yeah. It's on my list. I will make it out there at some point.
I don't know that you need to. It's, my wife says it's her worst nightmare, you know?
Yeah, but as someone who's so, quote unquote, like anthropologically at minimum, just because I'm so interested in the history of and Silicon
Yep.
Valley culture, like I just feel like I have to. Like I don't really like dirt and camping, which is like the part where I'm just like, ooh, like
Yep.
this like bathrooms and showers and like that stuff's a little gross to me. But I think it's something I gotta do at some point.
Yep. Go with experienced people and make
Yes.
yourself a real nice shade structure. Those would be my two
Shade
pieces of
structure.
shade
Oh,
structure. Yeah, you want a shade structure. It gets
that
really
makes
hot during
sense.
the day.
Yeah. Cool. Well, I want to change to some newer and more, in some ways, darker strains of, I guess, Silicon Valley subculture. So one
Sure.
thing that I feel like I've observed, lots of people have observed over the past decade, is that Silicon Valley in 2025 feels quite a bit less like libertarian, much more fascist adjacent than it did back then. I feel like
Mhm.
there even the forms of attempting to escape systems of top-down control, which of course still came with their own biases and unannounced hierarchies and things like that. But now I feel like a lot of the tech industry in Silicon Valley's interest in politics is actually, can we actually remake, rebuild, uh, coup these systems of hierarchy? Can we place ourselves at the top of these systems of
Yep.
control? And so, of course, like an Elon Musk Doge thing, which now is sort of falling apart, but like that sort of exemplifies it. Or even on a more local level, like I've just noticed that a lot of VCs and influential people in the Valley have gotten much more interested in local politics and funding races. And like
Yep.
in general, like even the new cities that are getting built, I would say like 10, 15 years ago, they were getting built in seasteading in the ocean or like in the Caribbean or like looking
Yep.
elsewhere. And now I feel like the new cities are actually in California in like normal, I guess, like legal terrain. And
Yep.
so I'm sort of curious what you make of what changed here and how Silicon Valley turned to an interest in hierarchy.
I think there's a couple different things. I think some things are continuous and some things have changed. The continuity comes all the way back from cybernetics through the counterculture, and that's the hope that business systems and technical systems would be better than politics. So Stewart Brand and his crew, they were just exactly not like the new left. They thought that business and technology were the way to make America a better place. And that's what we needed to work on. And so that idea that business and technology should replace politics,
Mm,
should stand in for politics, that idea predates the turn to the right, but sets the stage for it.
mm,
And so I think that's really important. And that's why when we come to the 80s and 90s, the new communalists could partner with a Newt Gingrich, who's a proto-authoritarian, because he too believed that business and technology were the royal road to social change. Okay, so that's the first. That sets the stage. Um, what I think really changes is, in my view, in the late aughts, 2006, 7, 8, with the rise of social media and the rise of what Shoshana Zuboff calls quick. What does she say? What is the phrase?
surveillance capitalism.
Surveillance capitalism. Thank you. That is the word. It wasn't coming back to me. But the notion that by harnessing attention and surveilling interactions, we can make just tremendous amounts of money. That once that kind of money is flying through the air, then CEOs start to do this funny thing. And I saw it first at Google. When I used to spend time around Google News in 2006, 2007. And when I got there, people were really like, "Oh, don't be evil. We're Google. We don't be
Mhm.
evil." Great. Well, I'd say, so what's good? Well, providing information for people is good. Not, okay. Who provides information for people? Well, we do. Google, we do. Oh, so you're suggesting that what's good for Google is good for the world? Oh, yeah, of course. And you get in that loop pretty quickly. And, money starts to be an emblem of what you're doing right. I mean, I've had people say to me like, well, Fred, if this product were so bad, people wouldn't use it.
Right. Yeah.
They don't
Yeah.
have to use it, right? I mean, as if consumer choice were the same thing as a political voice. It's ridiculous. So that kicks in, and now I'm making a pile of money. I want to keep making money. And by the way, money is a sign of the rightness of what I'm doing. And it begins to look like politics, regulators in particular, might get in the way of that.
Mhm.
might become grains of sand in my otherwise smoothly functioning gears. So what you start trying to do, as Zuckerberg did when he founded Facebook, was you start trying to use the parts of the state that you can to ensure your privileges. So Zuckerberg builds a famously two-tier stock structure inside Facebook, where he has the A shares, and he has enough of the A shares that every single decision is ultimately his if he wants it.
Mhm.
It is a dictatorship. He doesn't have to play it that way, but from the stock structure's point of view, he runs a dictatorship straight up. Okay. So works, I think, in the tech world. You have these very strong founders. You have Bezos, you have Larry and Sergey at Google, and Sundar Pichai, you have Zuckerberg. You have these very top-down firms that are very collaborative at lower levels, maybe, but at the top level, they really are dictatorships or very close to it.
Mhm.
And those folks have technologies that seem to be working, that seem to be able to map the whole world. They literally are as gods in the Stewart Brand sense. They
Mhm.
can see the whole earth through their systems, and they can run systems that, from where they sit, seem to be working pretty well. Look at all the money we're raking in. Meanwhile, from that position, government, real actual government of embodied people of all different social classes with all different levels of capability, looks really messy, sloppy, inefficient. It looks like it must be riddled with waste and fraud because our companies are so smooth, they run so smoothly, but the government seems to be so tangled up. What is that about?
Which is
Well,
also, side note, hilarious to think that the companies are not wasting money.
right. So I'm still a fan of a phrase that I think a lot of people find too extreme, but
Mm.
I'm a fan of the phrase technofascism. I think there's a way in which people in the tech world. So now we're talking about senior leaders: Thiel, Musk, Zuckerberg, Bezos, Pichai. They, I think, imagine a social world run on the terms that they run their companies.
Mhm.
And because their companies are successful, they believe that if they ran the social world on those same terms, they too would be successful. Now, what is success? This is where we get back to that body problem again. If success is seen in terms of your ability to circulate information and make money, well, that's the world of the cotton gin. That's the world of the cotton plantation. Yeah, you're really successful if you don't have one of those bodies that has to be out in the field chopping the cotton. If you're Amazon, you're really successful if you're not working in the warehouse. And as a society, that's not what politics is. Politics is about the redistribution of resources across groups that are otherwise competing with each other.
Mhm.
And that's not what these companies are about. And what they're about is the promise of smooth efficiency, just like Mussolini promised smooth efficiency.
Mhm.
Mussolini said, I'll get the trains to run on time. And then we'll have a society that will be well ordered, and all these other problems that seem so messy and difficult will just drop away. Well, they're not
Mm.
going to just drop away.
Yeah. There's a bunch of stuff I want to dig in on there.
Good, go for it.
Yes. Okay. So one of the earlier things that you mentioned is this idea that consumer choice is the same thing as like rights or political voice or something like that.
Yep.
And I think that is something that people feel very persuaded by. Like, if I want to gamble my money on sports, if I want to buy crypto, if I want to, have an AI girlfriend who I talk to, like, why can't I? It must be good for me if they're choosing it because no one's forcing you to use Facebook. No one's forcing you to like talk to character AI. Why is that a flawed way of thinking?
Yeah. So I was laughing. I'm trying to keep the steam from coming out my ears too fast. The first thing that's broken in that way of thinking is the notion of how compulsion works. That way of thinking suggests that compulsion is something where you are forced. That is to say, someone stands over you and whips you until you do whatever the thing it is. And that's not the way compulsion works at all. Consider what we were talking about earlier, dating apps. No one requires you to use a dating
Mhm.
app if you're at Stanford, right? You don't have to do it, but everybody's on them. You can be a data rebel, but that's making a real decision, right? But think about high school. High school, nobody forced you to wear the t-shirt that everybody else was wearing at that moment. Nobody forced you to shop at Forever 21 or wherever you shopped. I was in charge of my daughter's fashion choices, and we spent a lot of time at Forever 21. Um, you know, Nobody forces you to do that. But the desire to conform, the desire to be recognized by your peers, the desire to be part of an organization, that draws you in. Nobody forces me to use email.
Mhm.
But if I don't use email, boy, it's going to be hard to do some of the things that I need to do. And it's going to be hard to get stuff done. So there's a kind of structural compulsion that occurs that is not something you get to choose about. The variables within which you can choose are so constrained that what might feel like personal choice is not personal choice at all. Have you ever had that experience when you're like, oh, I don't know, at a party or with peers? It tends to happen when you're, teens or early 20s, maybe, where, everybody's making individual choices, but they're all the same choices.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah, of course.
Yeah. So that's the kind of phenomenon I'm catching here. Think about pop music. Why is it that everyone loves Chappell Roan right now? Right? Like, I like Pink Pony too, but
But,
know
like,
what?
what these tech folks would say is, like, "But that's just the free market. Chappell Roan is, in fact, a good artist, and so she deserves that
Oh, I
attention, and
love that. I love that. Yeah.
who are
Oh,
we
I
to
love.
blame Chappell Roan for satisfying consumer needs and creating art that everyone loves?"
Yeah, but you see the loop here, right? The free market is the excuse. It's like, it's a market. People want stuff. Great. Okay, fine. Um, do they want it? If it's all that they have on offer, is that what they want? If it's all that they see, is that what they want?
Mm.
One of the things that's been most fascinating to me in my life, this is again maybe an odd example, but I think it's an important one. When I was growing up in the 60s and 70s, the advertisements that you saw that featured women mostly as homemakers or models, maybe a little bit in the office. They were always slim, they were always white, and by the time I got to be 25 or 30, I pretty much thought that was the definition of beauty.
Mhm.
And it took me another 10 or 15 years to unlearn that and to be able to literally see the beauty in all these different shapes around me, different ages, different colors. One of the things that I think has been a generational turn that I just love is that the generation right after mine has come to really appreciate human variety in very new ways. But it took a great deal of work because the free market was very busy slamming us with things that sold,
Mhm.
but that were not, in fact, things that made us happy. We just didn't know to ask anything else.
Yeah. The other thing that I think about a lot is sort of what you want, like short term versus long term. There's a bunch of like economic sociology folks who are like sort of differentiate between like preferences and meta preferences. Like, okay, like if you put the
Right.
carrots and the fries in front of me, maybe right now I'm gonna grab the fries. But like in
That's
a meta sense, if I think about my life over the course of a month, would I prefer the version of myself that chose the fries every time? Probably not. I probably would have wished that I chose the carrots at least half the time or something like that.
I think it's exactly
Um,
right. And let me go even a little bit further and just play with this idea. I'm not sure I believe this, but I think I do, so I'll try it. If you're in business, who are you serving? What are you serving? Are you serving the god of choice, which will be the god of profit, which is, I think, a line that we see a lot around us today? Or maybe you're doing something else. I had the pleasure some years ago doing research to read the Ford Foundation reports from 1951 and 52, otherwise really boring stuff. But they had these corporate leaders, heads of automobile companies, and this is 7 years after the end of World War II. And they're sitting there saying, I do business for the good of America. I do business for my fellow man. And they're making what, 10 or 15 times what the guys on the line are making? Compare that to Bezos' salary and the difference now between Bezos' salary and the salary of the warehouse worker. If you are working to provide consumer choice in service of the quote free market, i.e., your shareholders, then you are not working in service of your fellow man, or at least not as much as you could be. If you put service, actual service of that long term vision, the health of your fellow citizens, for example, first, and didn't hide behind the story that you tell yourself about the free market, you might do a different kind of business. And there are people who are trying to do that.
mhm,
And American business used to do that. And we've lost
mhm.
track of it. Was something that was done at the height of industrial life in the 50s.
Okay, yeah, this we'll get to this in a second, but I do want to ask about like nihilism and acceleration. That
Well,
feels
I'll
related
let
to
oh,
me.
you're asking
Yeah.
all the good stuff.
Yes,
We
but
go right
first a
to the
couple
dark
other
side.
things. Another one where I want to play a devil's advocate really quick, or to sort of
Good.
steelman the tech position is you mentioned that politics is about the redistribution of resources between various groups
Yep.
and how you allocate them. And I think the tech person point of view here would be um, actually why are you thinking in such a constrained way about trade-offs? The world is positive sum. We should expand the pie. We should increase the supply of all things. This is why NIMBYism is so evil. We actually just need to build way more housing rather than attempting to redistribute the same few single family homes and the prices get higher. We should just be having wild abundance for everyone, and corporations can play a role in that, governments can play a role in that. But like, why are you thinking in such a, negative some way, basically?
Great. I love that, and I don't think the two are opposed. I'm all in favor of wild abundance. I'm just aware that when there is pie, some people try to eat more than others do. And one of the great things about the way that our government and the American government system was formed at the beginning was a system of checks and balances, because it's not as though when you create great abundance, people just want to share it. That's naive. They want to take it. They want to control it. They want to build power around it. We live at a time at which most individuals, including some of the poorest, live lives that are infinitely better resourced than we might have in the Middle Ages or the 17th century. And yet, even in that case, people at the top of the pyramid live entirely different lives than people farther down. And so I don't think abundance solves the problem of distribution. I'm all in favor of more abundance, and I'm more of all for everyone, absolutely. But I think that you can't get there without focusing on inequality and trying to adjust it.
Hmm. Yeah. And then the last thing I was going to say was this one's not even a question, but I was just when you were talking about the idea of these tech founders who essentially run dictatorships, as Zuckerberg does within their
No,
companies, thinking we're doing so well, the government seems really slow, like we should export this model. It just made me the like Yarvin sort of faction of Silicon
many,
Valley these
many.
days, right? Because I think that like they quite explicitly, like Yarvin, believes that America needs to be a monarchy
Oh,
because
well,
he
startup
looks
monarchy, a startup monarchy.
right, a startup monarchy because he looks at companies and thinks like this is the thing that we should bring into our governmental
Right.
institutions. Or another sort of like related area is like Sam Oberdra wrote this like big doc called Great Founder Theory. I don't know if you've seen
I
that.
haven't seen this. No, that's great. I'm
In
thinking in road.
2019 or something, it was getting passed around a lot, largely in Silicon Valley circles, Silicon Valley political theory, sort of neo-reactionary adjacent circles. And the argument that it makes is it's an revision of great man theory, as we all know. It's saying like,
No.
no, it's not about individual great men, it's about great founders. And the difference between a great man and a great founder is great founder creates an institution that outlasts him. And so like really the world has changed not by normal institutions nor by individual great men, but by individual great men who create institutions like companies that can outlast them. They
So
transform them in the way that Robert Moses did. And I think this is sort of like an interesting encapsulation of the sentiment.
I love that idea. I just don't think it has to be a great man. I like to think about the American Revolution, right? So my first
Mm,
interest was early American history. And, in the American Revolution, we tell stories about George Washington and Paul Revere, and that's great. They were great men. But the person we don't talk about who matters tremendously is Betsy Washington, right? I forget Washington's wife's first name. But in any case, Mrs. Washington, she hosts the dinners at
mhm,
which the conversations take place, at which the teams get built that can actually make the change.
mm.
We mentioned earlier, the sort of Tahrir Square and the Arab Spring. Analysts have argued that, Arab Spring failed not because people didn't communicate with one another, but because they hadn't built up the local over time networks of trust
Right.
that made it possible for them to withstand the inevitable blowback.
Mhm.
And that's the work that we need to do. And no single man does that. But I agree that institutions are where the action is.
Yeah, 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 yeah. Yeah, I like reading like Zainab's Twitter interrogas. Like I think I read it in
Exactly.
undergrad, right? And
Yep.
I think that was the thing that helped me like make sense of like this is the thing that got me into the internet. It seems so idealistic, so incredible. What happened there? And so I think that's sort of the turn towards like, oh, these communities or like social infrastructure is the thing that
Right.
matters. And when you make everything frictionless, you sort of like lose all the I think network internalities is what she calls them. Like you got to be printing out the posters and putting up the flyers and like working
Yep.
through a spreadsheet and phone banking with all your friends. And it's tedious work for sure. And like maybe you want to automate it, but as soon as you automate it, you lose the trust that you
Yeah. I mean, and
totally.
like if you ever worked on a project in the middle of the night with your friends,
Yeah.
you're going to be close with those people in a way that you're not going to be
Oh,
close with people you
absolutely.
can go through that with. Right.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, even just like making the print magazine, making Kernel with like, like Jacob and Hannah and the crew, like we are closer friends because print is so goddamn annoying. It's like a
Right.
real
Right.
pain.
I mean, but I mean, it's wonderful, right? I
Yeah,
mean,
it is.
yeah, exactly. Right.
Yeah. Cool. I want to talk about accelerationism.
Right.
Accelerationism these days is making a comeback in the form of EAC, which I'm sure you've seen floating around. So, but while EAC is sort of just like a Twitter meme that doesn't really seem to have any sort of like serious thinking, it's more just like a we hate the DEI safety, whatever, decelerationist. There is a longer history to accelerationism in both like a left wing form and right wing form, from the Italian futurist to sort of the UK rave scene to Donna Haraway. And I'd be curious to hear more about that from you. Where would you point to as the origins of accelerationism?
Oh boy. Yeah. I don't know that I could find a single origin. Um, I tend to see accelerationism as a kind of mindset that emerges as new revolutionary technologies appear. There are moments when new technologies like the steam engine, the cotton gin, the electric light bulb appear, and when they appear, they seem to open out a vista onto a whole new way of living, a whole new way of being. And what people close to the technologies want to do, whether they are electricians in the early 20th century working on electric lights, or whether they're, you know, manufacturers with the cotton gin, is they want to accelerate the development and distribution of this new machine, this new machinery, so as to bring about that new world ever more quickly. And that new world looks better, looks more efficient, looks more profitable than the one they're in. So I think accelerationism is a kind of companion to technological change, and it rears its head at moments of intense technological change like the one we're inhabiting right now. I don't think we've inhabited an era of media technological change as radical as this one, maybe ever.
Mm,
I mean, I think the last two generations of human beings have seen things that, several thousand years of human beings never saw. And I think we're really trying to figure it out. I think we've overestimated the power of the internet and underestimated the power of media in our everyday lives across the board. And in that setting, there are people who try to grab onto those technologies and say, well, we've got to push them forward. You saw this in Italy, as you said,
mhm.
with trains. The futurists embrace trains, speed, trains. The next thing you know, they're celebrating war. And the next thing you know, after that, they've got Mussolini. And so Accelerate is a kind of companion fantasy as new
Mm,
technologies emerge. And I think it's a deep confusion. Although one other thing, which is important to know, which is that accelerationism is a profitable discourse for people who make their living
mm.
developing and selling technologies. If accelerating technology is the job, then the people who make the technology make the money.
Right.
And
S
yeah,
So it's, the way you're describing it almost seems less like a coherent ideology and more just like an attitude or something or a mood?
I think it's an attitude with varied beliefs, some from the
Okay.
left, some from the right, as you suggested earlier. And some of the beliefs are, so Dick Chernyshek has written a book that I actually thought was kind of interesting, where he critiqued left folk politics, which
Right.
are sort of about voice and about let's get together and we'll sing Kumbaya nicely and, order will emerge and things will be good. He said, like, stop all that. We live in a world of high tech and we need to develop high tech, maximize our ability to communicate with one another using these new information technologies, and order will emerge after that. You see it in Srinivasan's network state book in a big way.
Mm, mhm.
It's time now to leave the land behind. The land is epiphenomenal. What we need to do is build community in these digital spaces, use the technology to accelerate human advancement. Now, here's where it gets interesting. Human advancement toward what?
Right.
Right? So some people like Kevin Kelly, who is a born again Christian, will argue that we're getting toward the Godhead. Other people will say we're headed toward the singularity. Other people will say, well, we're just headed toward a better society. But there's always a kind of toward, a sense of progress. And the actual beliefs that get attached to that vary, but the sense of progress, the teleology never does. And I think that's a mistake. By the way, I wouldn't include Donna Haraway in this. I
Mm,
would actually pull Donna Haraway out of this and argue that she argues against teleology, and that's one of the good things about her. Now, she argues many things from many sides over the years, and so you can't really say there is one Donna Haraway view. But I think when she talks about staying with the trouble, what she's talking about is the trouble of not having a teleology, of
mm.
not living a story. We're not all going to heaven. Right? There's not going to be a revolution. This fantasy that we can just press a button and leap forward into a better future is a fantasy. What we can do is work collaboratively with each other, and particularly with people who are different from and less empowered than ourselves, and make our local world better. And if enough people do that, the whole thing gets better.
Mm. And so that clarification makes sense, especially when you clarify accelerationism as being about this teleology, about
Yeah.
like accelerating towards some point
Yeah.
aggressively. One thing that was interesting to me was I think in one of your essays about accelerationism, you use the phrase nihilist rabbit hole. And I seized onto it because nihilism is a word that comes to me when I think about a lot of the current mood in technology is a
Yep.
lot of the vice signaling. People at this point actually thrown away a lot of the like global connectedness, like what diversity poster stuff. The tech companies are just like, it doesn't matter. Like Trump's in office, we're gonna suck up to him. Somebody else is in office, we're gonna throw
Yep.
that away and suck up to them. All feels very nihilistic to me. And I'm curious what you meant by nihilistic rabbit hole, or like where you see the nihilism in accelerationism.
Boy, the nihilism and acceleration is all the way down. This gets back to the thing we were talking about earlier, the denial of the body. If you are alive in this world and you love yourself, you may have feelings about your body, but you're going to love your body. You're going to love your embodied body. You're going to love where you are now. You are not going to be straining to
Mm,
accelerate a departure from where you are now and an arrival somewhere else. You're going to learn how to be here now. The opposite of nihilism is being fully present to oneself and to one's friends and loved ones. And nihilism is shutting all that down, turning inward. It's a kind of pseudo-erotic attachment to death and to destruction, to the kinds of power that go with that. Trump is all over this, of course. Cruelty. Cruelty is the nihilist's friend. Nothing matters. So I'm going to take the kinds of pleasures that are off the table when things do matter. When things matter, you don't hurt people.
Yeah.
You don't. It's only after you've given up that you can commit the kinds of cruelty that we're seeing here. You've given up attachment. And people like Mussolini, who were he was an accelerationist, child of Italian futurists in many ways, he thought that we would just rocket forward into this era, but he did it in a way that was entirely nihilistic. It brought pain across the board. It was not engaged with the world that he inhabited in real time. It was about making the trains run faster to a destination yet to be determined. Well, the destination that they reached in Germany was, of course, the camps. And my hair is completely on fire with regard to our political situation at the moment. I think it's only our president's clumsiness so far that's saving us from a more rapid delivery to authoritarianism. When you see masked troops disappearing American citizens on the streets, you're really close to some really ugly stuff that we thought would never happen again. And I think acceleration takes us down that road. Nihilism is permission to be cruel.
Mm. Yeah, the attitude that I see in Silicon Valley these days from at least sort of the tech right faction is like before we said we weren't going to be evil and we were going to save the world. And then some people said that we were doing it wrong or that we were making mistakes and we weren't doing a good enough job of that. And so now we will throw away all of our pretense of saving the world, say, yes, we are just trying to make a lot of money and build a lot of technology. And like, yes, we're going to run over a bunch of people in the process and we don't care anymore. I almost feel like that's sort of the attitude now. Like almost a sense of morality and perfection are unattainable. So like, who cares? Like, we're not trying anymore.
Right. Well, it's a little bit like, Trump's embrace of the fossil fuel industry. We all know that we have to get away from that. We have to decarbonize or the planet will fry. But if we turn toward fossil fuels and embrace them as Trump has done, we can have that kind of demonic pleasure. It's like the Dr. Strangelove pleasure. I don't know if you remember Dr. Strangelove, where the general hops on the bomb as it goes down and rides it all the way down to Russia, the nuclear bomb, like a cowboy. Whoopee! That kind of the pleasure of total submission to the evil, to the bad. I mean, religious writers used to know about this. You know who the best looking character in Paradise Lost is? Satan. Satan comes down from heaven, and boy, is he spectacular. And what I see right now in Silicon Valley is a fascination with the incredible powers of the technologies we're developing, the incredible amounts of money flowing through them, the things that you can do when you have that kind of money. You are as a god.
Yeah, it's an adrenaline high of like,
adrenaline high.
Yeah. And I think like there's also this interesting generational thing going on where I hear this when people do like sort of like Gen Z culture analysis, but I think there's truth to it where I think Gen Z is also a relatively nihilistic generation. There's almost like this like get my bag culture, which is like everything's a scam anyway. Like we've all already lived in a post-truth society. I think about how younger Gen Zs have never voted in a election that didn't have Trump in it. Like that's the primary way you understand politics work is grift and scam.
Yeah.
And as a result, you have a culture of like, well, if everyone else is just like grifting and scamming, I better get my own bag. And so sort of the way that the creator economy works now, I think a lot about media and journalism, and YouTubers are taking money from shady sources, not disclosing them. Everything is an ad that they're not going to disclose as an ad. Or even like if you've seen the Cluely startup stuff that's going on Twitter, there's basically this startup started by this like 20-year-old or something. He got kicked out of Columbia because he made a app to help people cheat on their coding interviews. And then he was like, his new startup is called Cheat on Everything, Cluely. And they use kind of like these like purposely very inflammatory ads and marketing style that's very much like pro cheating. Like everything is a scam, like coding interviews are a scam, dating is a scam. So we're just going to build AI that tells you the answers for any scenario you might be in. And they're purposely very provocative, very inflammatory. They're all very young. Like it's like 20-year-old influencers and tech guys. And it's very distasteful, but I think it exemplifies a sort of like Gen Z get my bag culture of like, again, like our president's been a scammer for the last like what, like 10
Yeah.
years. So if you're gonna be the moral and virtuous ones, you're just gonna lose, I think is the attitude that people have.
That is so fascinating and so depressing. I'm thinking of, the men who believe that the way that you date is to, manipulate people. There's what are they
Yeah. Like
what is that called?
pickup
Gaming?
artists. There's like
Pickup
the
artists.
game, and then there's pickup artists and the red pill, and they're all kind of related.
Right, and they're all kind of related, and they all have in common the thing that you just flagged, which is that somewhere everybody's grifting. So I've got to get my grift on, and here's my game, here's my hustle,
Mhm.
and what disappears there is the thing that we were talking about earlier, the possibility of true intimacy. Right? If you're
Mhm.
if you're a pickup artist, you're gonna have a lot of trouble falling in love. You're just gonna have a lot of trouble with that, and someone's gonna have a lot of trouble loving you because you're not
Mhm.
there. You're doing the pickup artist thing. And that pattern, I think, shows up in lots of other places. I'm sorry to hear about Cluley. It reminds me actually of Weimar Germany, in the late 20s, early 30s, which was a period when, we romanticize it with Sally Bowles and, but it was a rough time in which everybody was hustling.
Mm.
Everybody was hustling. There wasn't quite enough money. Leadership was bad. Everybody was hustling. And it does start to feel a little bit like that now.
Yeah, it's really crazy, and I think that maybe the thing that needs to happen is a reframing of what winning is, because, like, in a certain sense, you're right that, like, if you grift, you will win, you might get richer than your friends. If
Mhm.
you use these pickup artist tactics, you might, in the short term, get a few women to sleep with you, but is that really winning? Are you really gonna be happy? Are you really gonna be fulfilled? Like, to me, it's like the answer is no, like, these a lot of the men who get really rich in Silicon Valley seem to live quite lonely and depressing lives, not all of them, but a lot of them, and I
Yep.
think probably the more forms of vice and whatever you engage in, the more depressing your life is. Like, I don't think Elon Musk is, like, a happy guy, but yeah, I feel like it sort of requires people to reframe, like, what is winning? Like, what reward are
I
you
love this.
going
I
for at
love
the
this.
end?
I would love to see you write an essay called "Is That Really Winning?"
Mm,
'Cause I think that's exactly right. And one of the challenges that we have in our time too is that alternative systems for describing winning have faded out. Religion is one of them. Religion is
mhm.
making a big comeback, but unfortunately, it's very conservative religion. It's conservative
Yeah.
Catholicism. It's Southern Baptism. You know, but I would like to see systems of meaning that are not necessarily connected to the pursuit of profit, the acceleration of technological development, and the gaming of one another.
Mhm,
And you've got to have those as references. In lieu of that, you have to have people in your life who can model other ways of being. If you're
mhm,
only on the internet and your parents are out at their jobs 24 hours a day, you're not going to get that. You have to have people show you what it means to be a good person.
mhm. Yeah, I mean, the religion thing gets at sort of the Christopher Lash stuff a little bit because, I thought it was interesting 'cause I read The Culture of Narcissism a few years ago, and it was very interesting. It totally made sense why, Lash is having such a revival. Like, a lot of the critiques of therapy
Yeah.
culture and individualism and whatever feel very prescient.
Mhm.
But the thing that, like, annoyed me a little bit is that he almost has this, like, weird nostalgia for religious authority that I think
Oh,
is, like,
it's not. Yeah. I mean, he has a deep
yeah,
nostalgia for.
okay. It's, like, pretty aggressive and nostalgia for religious authority, and that's why you see this, like, conservative Catholic revival going on, and I don't like that as a solution to modern malaise. I would like to have a different thing going on.
No,
Yeah.
I think Lash offered a fabulous diagnosis,
Mhm.
and the wrong cure. The part of Lash that I try to hang on to in his private life was that he was a very serious family guy.
Mm.
Every year at Christmas, he would make a photo album for the family of the things the family had done that year. And, it's goofy, it's super traditional. It's the kind of thing that now you might find in a more religious family than a secular one. But it's really sweet, and he's really working at holding the institution of his affections together. That I really value. The longing for a hierarchy as Catholic priests, men in dresses. Yeah, no,
Yeah.
not loving that part as much. No, not loving that part as much. So,
Mm. Are there, technologies that you see as facilitating democracy or community in a serious way?
yeah, the first and foremost of those is print. Print is enormously powerful. Print on paper. Print on paper travels. It's, Bruno Latour used to call it an immutable mobile. It doesn't change. It isn't easy to change. You can argue over it. You can hand it to one another. You can pass it forward. It's much harder to game. You can't apply an AI to it in real time. When I go to Germany, I work in Germany a lot, and when I go there, I get off the plane in Berlin, and there's always a newspaper stand,
Mm.
enormously powerful. So print is an enormously powerful technology. You can see that books have persisted despite all the efforts to blast us with Kindles and Nooks and all the
Mhm.
things that we blasted with. Books persist. I think that's a hugely pro-democratic technology.
And what do you
Another,
think it is about, like, the immutability? Is it sort of the Walter Wrong thing of, like, you can sit with it individually and, like, reason, or what do you think is special about that?
I think a few different things. I think the first thing is that it's there for you to go to and come back, go away from and come back to.
Mm,
You
mhm,
know, each time I come back to the internet, it's like coming back to a river. Yeah, there's
mm,
water, but it's all different. There's nothing that's ever sort of the same there. A book can travel through time to you unchanged. So I'll read Greek philosophy. It's traveled 2,000 years to me in print and is available to me. Whereas if I go looking for something that maybe somebody wrote on the internet 10 years ago, it's gone unless the Wayback Machine saved it. So I think traveling through time is one thing. I think another thing is that books, to survive, they get selected. Now, not all the great books survive through time, and some really bad books do survive. Okay. But over time, this is the magic of the truly free marketplace. Over time, institutions gather around books. I mean, hell, Christianity's all about this one book called the Bible. You can build entire institutions around texts in a way that's hard otherwise. Farming becomes possible because we know how to do bills of sale. We know how to keep
mm.
track of things. Reading and writing, I would argue, are the essential technologies of democracy. Another piece that I think is incredibly important, but isn't a technology, it's a practice. It's the practice of conversation, and particularly conversation across difference. So that the technology for that would be a kind of infrastructural technology. Whether you're religious or not, churches have historically been places where people with very different political views could come together and worship. The worship was in this space not called politics. It was called
Mhm.
church or something else. And because it was called church, then in the coffee hour you could talk to people who are quite different than yourself. And I think those kinds of spaces where that happens are incredibly important. Like I said, I fish, I paddle a canoe, I have a much more working class life up in Maine than I do in California. In here, I'm able, because I'm fishing with people and canoeing, to have conversations about politics that are very difficult and that I couldn't have in other settings. So I think that practice of third place conversations with people who are different than yourself is critical. And institutions that make it necessary for you to encounter, bump into, and engage with people who are not like you are key.
Yeah. I, imagine then, because I wanted to talk about AI next, that you are is quite skeptical of I mean, AI is profoundly individualizing, right? I think, like, that's one of the things. It allows
Mm.
personalized media, personalized, conversation, with just you and the computer. At least with social media, there's some semblance of, like, encountering other humans. With AI, you don't need to do that at all. In fact, you can have infinite conversations with, like, avatars and agents with their own personalities, and not a single one of them has a body in the real world, and 2 people can encounter a piece of media that's personalized just for them. But, yeah, I'm curious, like, how are you thinking about AI?
Well, I can't tell if I'm just in denial, but
Mm,
I've lived through now several earlier rounds of incredible tech enthusiasm and claims that the world was about to end. One of these came in the early '60s with the rise of automation, and people were just terrified that automating labor would result in generations of unemployed people, and whole schools of thought were devoted to what do people do once they don't have to work anymore. Well, people found things to do. Um, you know, I went through the virtual community craze of the 1990s when everything was going to be commons-based peer production and we were not going to need
mm,
factions anymore. And now here we are with AI, and AI is going to replace this, that, and the other. It's going to take our jobs. My own take is that AI is a whole lot less important than people think it is. And I'll hold that view until it becomes a lot more effective than it is. I use AI on a regular basis, but I use it for tasks that it's well suited to. An AI that's worked on a very large language model has imbibed a kind of middle mind.
mhm,
So when I give it my work and say, read this back to me in the middle mind, it produces my work as it would for Time Magazine for an eighth grade reader. It's great.
mhm.
I love it. Great. It's very useful. Would I use AI to do real historical digging, to interpret a text from the past? No, no, not at all. Nor am I especially worried about the people who talk too much to AI. I
Mm.
mean, I think there are lots of other things you could talk to. You can talk to your search engine, you can talk to your dolls, you can talk to all kinds of things. I'm just not very worried about it.
Oh, interesting. So you don't think it's as significant or as radical of a new media form as, say, the
Correct. I
internet?
think it's an extension of search,
Mm,
um, some degree of social media in the ways that you just described it. It's kind of yet another de-skilling of social media. Um, sort of where, the person you're talking to doesn't even have to be there anymore. You can just have a bot. But I'm really, I don't know. I just don't think AI is our biggest worry right now.
hmm,
I'm very worried about the future of democracy,
mhm,
and I'm very worried about corporate leaders who are trying to take advantage of the authoritarian in office
mhm,
to promote technologies that will make them a great deal of money. And one of the ways that you do that is you stir up a great deal of attention, anxious attention, as well as benevolent attention for the technologies that you're developing. And that's one of the things I see happening around AI. There's a wonderful article written in the 1990s by a scholar of technology named Rob Kling and his partner in crime, Susan Yacono, and it's called Computerization Movements. And it's about this kind of thing when
mm,
when a new technology emerges and a movement forms around it to assert its importance. It may not even be to promote it, maybe to critique it, but it
mhm.
asserts it puts it at the center of the discussion. I don't actually think AI should be at the center of our discussion right now. I think military policy, economic policy, distribution of resources, social problems first. That's where our attention should be.
Mm. And you think that corporate leaders are moving it into the center of political discussion to give themselves more power? Is that what you're
Yeah.
suggesting?
Yeah. I mean, the people that I see moving it to the center of discussion are people in AI and cognitive industries.
Right.
I don't see the manufacturers of shoes, you
Hmm.
know, screaming about AI. I see them screaming about tariffs and labor in China.
Hmm.
And so I do think that's the case. They may fully believe that AI
Yeah.
is like the
I
future.
do think they believe it, but it is a self-serving belief, as you say, and these things are hard to disentangle.
Oh, very hard to disentangle. And I think that's one of the definitions of ideology is that it's something that you believe. It's not just a belief; it's a system of beliefs
Mm.
that you inhabit. Right. An event at Stanford, which I found completely fascinating, in which two people who will go unnamed for reasons that will become clear in a second got up and spoke. And one was a very famous political scientist, former government official. The other was arguably one of the most eminent people working in AI today. And they got up and they said in tandem, where they're talking about Europe, Europe. The first one says they regulate, and the second one says we innovate. That's
Yeah.
ideology in action.
Yeah.
Regulation is social innovation, and it's an attempt to defend the parts of life that AI doesn't speak to. So yeah, I think there's a big hustle underway.
Hmm.
Not especially taken by the machines. I don't think they're actually as interesting or as effective as their makers seem to say they are. And I think that they are really drawing the attention of many good people away from problems that are more pressing.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, one of the things that I do worry about with, AI and the military stuff is that, um, AI costs so much money, and they've poured in so much money, and they really and it's also a technology that's very publicly unpopular. Like, if you in all the
Mhm.
public opinion polls, people don't like AI. Most Americans are worried about it, fearful of it, do not
Mhm.
want AI in their workplaces, dealing with their stuff, whatever. And the one part of what I see, which could be conspiratorial of me, is that part of the reason that AI gets played up so much in the US China context of like, we need to do AI and we need to accelerate AI because China, because we have to have democratic AI be authoritarian AI. And this is going to be the deciding factor in whether the US or China wins. Like,
Mhm.
that's sort of the party line across all of the AI labs and the government right now is because I feel like that's their saving grace in hoping to not be regulated. Because I think like if it were left up to non-military concerns, I think that AI would absolutely be regulated because big tech is unpopular in a bipartisan way. Public opinion wise, big tech is unpopular, AI is unpopular, and the only way they can sort of persuade Democrats and Republicans not to to regulate AI more aggressively is to say like we're going to go extinct because something China wore.
Well,
And that's
what
very concerning.
It's very concerning. And what you're flagging here is something that manufacturers of all devices do as they come online. They reach to attach their devices to already existing stories that have purchased in
Yeah.
institutions that need to have access at. Right. So the story that we have to defend America against China, that's as old as Christmas in the United States, right? And communism bad. And so Senator Smith, who actually doesn't know anything from a large language model, you're going to help us defend against communism. Of
Right.
course, we'll give you money, right? And so the job of people like Sam Altman is precisely to attach themselves to those kinds of
Mhm.
stories.
Yeah, and especially something that's so totalizing, has so much bipartisan support, and also anything that I mean, this is like my own tangent, but like, really have a lot of trouble with like X risk discourse because as soon as you make something existential, you can outweigh everything else. You can say,
Right.
well, when we have a prospect of nuclear war, who cares about redistribution, social policy, blah 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 blah, blah, because like obviously
Exactly.
nuclear war would be so much worse, and so it is kind of this trump card that you can use. And then I'm sort of like, you think that authoritarian AI can only be built by the CCP? Well, you
Right.
know,
Right.
anyone
No,
can build
exactly.
authoritarian AI in this world.
Right. So a former student of mine, Daniel Axelrad, did a wonderful study early in his time at Stanford of not AI, but digital military interfaces in the battlefield.
Hmm.
And one of the things that they did was they accelerated the decision-making time so quickly that a soldier had found himself firing before they had fully thought out the decision to fire. That has deadly consequences in
Yep.
every direction. And that's the kind of thing that really matters, right? You can see there's another dynamic in the military is that, famously generals compete with each other by virtue of controlling technologies. Oh, I have
Mm.
100 tanks. I have 100 missiles. I'm so important.
Mhm.
All right. Once you have 100 tanks and 100 missiles, you got to use them.
Yeah.
And there's a sort of way in which the technology demands to be used. And, oh, that scares the heck out of me.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Well, I'm curious to turn to more like consumer AI stuff. You are
Sure.
a humanities professor at a moment that a lot of people think that the humanities is in crisis, partly because of AI, partly because of
Yeah.
video, partly because of higher education's in crisis. I don't know.
Mhm.
I'm just very curious, like, what is it like being a humanities professor right now?
It's a really interesting business. I feel endlessly lucky to be one. Um, and I feel especially lucky to be one at Stanford. About 30% of my students are computer science majors. And I find them fascinating to talk to. And I think that one of the opportunities that we have at Stanford in particular is to build a humanities that takes technology seriously, engages with it directly. I mean, the kind of work that you do would be right down the middle for the kind of humanities that I think we need. Now, to get there, we need to know our history. We need to know who Machiavelli was. We need to know who John Milton was. We need to know our history. But when we know our history, and we look squarely at the systems that are being built around us, we can ask the kind of questions that are hard to ask if you only see those systems and you don't know the history. I've been part of the Human-Centered AI project at Stanford for a while, and my mission there is to expand the definition of human beyond user.
Mm.
In the tech world, people talk about humans all the time, but almost invariably they mean user. And many of the people who are doing that class have not thought hard about what it means to be human in the 18th century, the 19th century. I was completely smitten by Bashan's network state, not by the book as a whole, but by his call for history. That
Mm.
book opens with a call for
Mhm.
history. It says, look, if you're going to build a state, you have to know what states have been and you have to know what people have been. And we're going to use new technologies, but we have to do it in a way that's in accord with humanity's deepest aspirations. And the humanities are what keep track of those aspirations. So I feel like it's an enormously valuable thing to be doing at this particular moment. Now, at Stanford, the number of humanities majors is much lower than the number of engineering and science majors. Fair enough. But I'll tell you, the humanities majors that we have are some of the best minds I've ever seen. I teach in American studies as well as communication. Oh my gosh, the undergraduates there. I have one who wrote an honors thesis that, were she a little older, I would have sent it to my magazine editor and said, just do this. I mean, the stuff I see is amazing. So I think the humanities have a future. I do think humanists need to be able to speak from their knowledge of, say, 15th century Arabic script to a present that is suffused with Python.
Hmm.
You have to be able to make those jumps. And that's what good humanists have to do now. But I think we can do that.
Yeah. What are some of the ways that you do that that you feel like are really resonating with your computer science students in your
Sure.
classes?
So my main vehicle is this course I teach called Rise of Digital Culture. It's an undergraduate course aimed for mostly juniors and seniors. About 30% of the students who take it are computer science majors. It starts with cybernetics in the late 40s and goes to the rise of Facebook. And it's a study of how new technologies, new business models, and new ideas of what a good society are co-evolve. And I worked through several periods, the Cold War period, the sort of virtual community period of the 90s, and then the social media period of closer to the present. As we move through those moments, the students see that what they know now could have been otherwise and was for a while.
Mm.
They also start to see how decisions that people made for the most benevolent reasons could have gone wrong. So you see the cyberneticists of the 40s and 50s believing that information systems are the key to democratic leveling that will prevent us from ever having to face fascism again. But by the end of the course, you're looking at Mark Zuckerberg and his stock structure and Facebook, the very same technologies the cyberneticists celebrated, and you're seeing the emergence of an authoritarian corporate leader and an authoritarian public life. And I think it blows their minds. I think for them, it helps, particularly technology students, it helps them recognize that they are social actors. They're not just
Hmm.
builders of machines or systems, but they're social actors in every sense of the word, and they're really important that way. And I think that's valuable. I love it. I just love it.
Yeah, yeah. Do you have to adapt the way that you do grading and assignments because of LLMs?
You know, I've been a little bit, I've been teaching less than usual lately because I've been chairing our department.
Mm,
And so I haven't had to do it yet because the courses I've taught are seminar based. And
mm,
so
yeah.
LLMs don't really fit there. This coming year, I'll be teaching 2 very large courses. And yeah, the first thing we're going to do in Communication 1, Media, Culture, and Society, day 1, is we're going to have an hour-long discussion about how we should use LLMs and craft an LLM strategy.
Mm,
Um, because they're just too easy to use. And
yeah.
when I first started teaching with LLMs, I tried to prohibit them.
Mhm.
And one of my students said to me, "Well, Professor Turner, you sound just like my professor used to sound when they talked about Wikipedia."
Yeah.
And I'm like, "Yeah, actually, you're right. Nuts." And AI is about as good as Wikipedia. You know, it's good. It's about 70% good, right?
Mhm.
So we have to find a way to work with it, not against it. I'm not sure what that way is yet. The one thing I'm most concerned about is I don't want to de-skill our students. One of the things we teach very powerfully is writing. You
Yeah.
know, we make you really own your words and hone your words, hone your thinking through writing and rewriting. If you're using an LLM to get you through that, you're going to leave without the skill set that I'm trying to build.
Mhm.
And honestly, that's the most valuable thing I give you in my class. I give you the attention of someone who's spent his whole life writing to help you find language for the things you care most about and to save those things in the world. And if you're letting the LLM stand in for you at that moment, you will be a de-skilled person, and that will hurt you later in life. I can't prevent it, I don't think, but I hope they don't do
Mhm.
it.
Yeah, a few conversations come to mind. One is I remember talking to a software engineer friend of mine about why he feels because software engineers have really embraced LLMs, right? Like they use coding assistants all the
Hmm.
time, most of them,
Hmm.
and there are very few qualms about it. And most people feel like it makes them better engineers, not worse. And one difference there is that in writing, you figure out what you want to say while you're trying to say it. You
Correct.
don't already know what you want, whereas usually software engineers, they're handed a spec. They already know exactly what the end picture is, and they just need to
Right.
produce that. And if the LM helps you do it faster or helps you like get through some bug or some block, like it's like, sure, let's do it. Whereas with writing, like oftentimes I have an idea that I think is a good idea. And then I start researching and I start writing. And I realize halfway through that my whole thesis is bunk and it doesn't actually make any sense. And
Mhm.
there's a bunch of logical holes. And then I have to redo everything. And I end up writing kind of a different essay than what I planned. Whereas
Yep.
the LLM, if I were to use that, would have just sort of, I don't know, spun the facts and whatever to like fit the thing that I thought I was going to write. But it feels like the difference is that like I don't know what I'm writing until I finish writing. Like the process
Ab-
feels much more
That's
important.
absolutely right. And it's a lot like dating apps. Dating apps force you to take your very individual person and
Mm,
conform it to a series of norms so that you are recognizable to other people.
mhm,
An LLM, when you deploy it in your writing, at least for me, it makes my writing sound like an eighth grader's writing.
mhm. Yeah.
All my sentences suddenly have 3 clauses. You know, there's all, the threes, like, it was this and this and this, and then it
Yeah.
was this and this,
It's
and
not this, it's that is the other
yeah,
one they
right,
love.
exactly. Right. Like, oh, yeah, it's this awful 5 paragraph essay stuff. So I hope that students will see the difference in quality between what the
Mm,
LLM gives them and what they can work toward if they do it themselves.
yeah.
I'm not sure everyone will. I think,
Yeah. I mean, college students, we're always looking for shortcuts.
yeah,
You know?
I do give this talk that I think my students ultimately probably ignore, but I try to give them a sort of a lesson from deep middle age, right? Like, I'm 64. I'm looking back through time. I see you and you're 21, you're 20, you're in my class. I'm here to tell you there are very few parts of your life where you're going to have 3 or 4 years of
Mm,
world-class experts focused on your development to help you do that. I mean, I know you got a lot of stuff going on. I know you got parties. I know you got fencing team, whatever it is, but this is something extraordinary. And just because it came easily to you, more or less, you had to take a few tests, work hard in school, doesn't mean it's not an incredible gift. So use it. That's what I say to my students. Now, I don't know if they believe me. I also tell them grades don't matter very much, which I also
which is
believe.
true. Yeah.
It's very true, but they don't believe that.
I know. They have to unlearn it. It's because Stanford selects for all the kids who like were really good at
Sure.
thinking that grades mattered,
Yep,
and then like having to unlearn that is very hard for people.
I agree.
But yeah, I totally agree. The other thing that I was thinking about is like seminars and Oxford style tutorials is the other thing. Is like I studied abroad at Oxford when I was at Stanford, and I
Mhm.
love that course because I was at the Internet Institute. I was studying like online social networks with Dr. Bernie Hogan, and he was great. But he was like, it was scary at first because American universities aren't set up this way to have to be grilled one on one for an hour every
Mm.
week on what you write. It's not just like, oh, I write an essay. I could have, I mean, we didn't have good LLMs, but like if I had it write the essay, that hour would have been absolutely mortifying because I couldn't
Yeah,
explain a single
exactly.
decision. And so I think like the one hope that I have is the return of both maybe tutorials in the United States, but also small seminar-based discussion classes, as you mentioned. Because by the end of my undergrad, I was only taking seminars anyway, because that's what I preferred.
Yeah, it's the way to go. And one of the horrors of my life was at Stanford has been that it wasn't until about 18 years in that I taught a class smaller than 50 at the undergraduate
Really?
level. Yep.
Wow. My
It
favorite
was-
classes, the ones that I remember the most, were classes of like
Oh,
10 people,
of
and you
course.
really get to know everyone and to like argue your ideas through, and you feel like you actually know the professor. And yeah, it's a
Yeah,
conversation thing that you mentioned. And you also can't
absolutely.
fake it. Like you got to
Right.
be there, you got to be responding. It's very dynamic. And so,
And I think you just actually laid out a political principle. It's so interesting. I hadn't thought about this, but it is true that the big class principle is in some ways like the internet or like broadcast TV.
oh,
And the small class principle is where you can know one another in your complexity
mm-hmm.
and test yourself and find out what you believe and what you think as you engage others.
Mm.
While at the same time building the unity that is the seminar. That's a process. That's a political process that I would love to see elsewhere. And teachers can corrupt it. I've seen teachers be
Yeah, of
cruel and
course.
give bad grades, and they can just mess it up. But if they're reasonably benevolent and thoughtful,
Mm-hmm.
and the students are too, the community that you build in a seminar is an amazing thing.
Yeah. Yeah, that's really interesting. I hadn't thought about that, like the
Me
lecture as
either.
broadcast
Me either.
media,
That was
but
great.
like I think you're onto something there. I think there's something good.
But no, but
Uh,
notice how it came about too. It only came about
yeah,
because the two of
yeah,
us were in conversation. I could never have thunk that up on my own.
yeah,
But this is what Brian Eno, the musician,
yeah.
talks about as genius, not genius, right?
Mm,
This is when you have multiple people collaborating together, there's a genius that can emerge out of that group that could
hmm.
never have emerged out of any one mind.
Yeah. I mean, that's the thing about the podcast. I've only started really podcasting a lot more like 6 months ago this year. And I've been trying to think about what makes good guests and et cetera. And then one of the principles that I sort of landed on after trial and erroring a bunch of podcasts
Yeah.
is like, sometimes you get a guest who just wants to talk their book the whole time. They're not really there to have a conversation. They're there to like summarize the things that they wrote about, but
Yeah.
like they won't really engage you on anything else. And I was like, I only want to do podcasts where it feels like both people are participating, and it feels like both of us will hopefully come out with like at least one thought that we hadn't had
No,
before
absolutely.
that we couldn't
I
have reached just by reading each other's books or whatever.
absolutely. And I'll say that it goes exactly the same for me, right? I turned down most podcasts precisely because they don't have that element, because they seem to be asking me to report
Mm,
on a book.
yeah.
And I want to exactly have this kind of conversation.
Yeah. Well, thanks so much. This is really lovely.
My pleasure. My pleasure.
Um,
You keep doing what you're doing. I'm so happy to be able to talk with you, and you're one of the people I learned from. So I feel very lucky.
No, same to you. This is great. I guess the last question that we always ask folks is like, I say we as if there's more people. The last question that I always ask folks is what research rabbit hole you're currently going down. So I'd love if you could give us a quick preview of what your new book is about that you're
Sure,
working on.
sure. So I'm working on a book that read at the moment is titled "City of Desire," and it's about New York, the New York art world in the '70s and '80s, and how in that world, a media technology revolution that we've forgotten, the rise of cable television, of video, of cassette recorders, the Sony Walkman, collided with two social movements, feminism and gay rights. And as those things collided, and as artists worked at the sort of face of that collision, I argue they brought us the very beginnings of what we now call identity politics.
Hmm.
And so that's what I'm doing. I'm studying the art world from the mid '70s to the early '90s, '75 to '93. Yeah, so that's what I'm doing. I'm pretty far down that rabbit hole.
When's the book gonna come out?
Well, that's a great question. I think about 2 years. I think
Okay.
all my books take 5 years more or less, start to finish, and then a year
Mm.
to publish. So I think we'll see the book on the shelves in about 2 years, something like that. That's my hope.
Cool. Well, I'm super excited to read it. Yeah, that's a very fun period of New York art history. So
It's
that'll
a
be a really
wild
fun one.
time. It's a
Yes, a
wild
wild
time.
time. Yeah.
Yep.
Cool.
Great.
Well,
All
thank
right.
you so much, Fred. This was so fun. I learned a lot from you, and
Same
yeah,
way.
had a blast.
Same way. Jasmine, thank you very much. You have a great evening.
You too. Bye bye.